and welcome back to another episode of Exos Heroes, and today we'll continue our tier list into the legendary heroes, and specifically, in today's episode we'll focus on the attackers. So there's a total of 11 attackers, and I think there are definitely some very good heroes within this group, but at the same time, as we analyze some of them, we do feel like a lot of them are quite underwhelming as well. So with that being said, let's jump into it right away. At number 11, we'll start with Sernando. So I know we disagreed a little bit on this one, so Edward, why don't you share your opinion first?
Sure. So, naturally, you put Sernando at the bottom of the list, and I'm not quite sure I agree. And let me go over my rationale here, right? So, first of all, mana utilization 2 is not the best passive, but it's not the worst passive. I think when you upgrade it to level 3, it becomes really quite good. But at level 2, it just lacks that mana gen that a lot of the level 3 passives have. It's not Sernando's fault, that's just the way the passives are, and a lot of these heroes are stuck with level 2 passives, so that's all I have to say about that. As we get into his A1 though, this is where I really want to focus in. Increase critical hit of all allies by 48 for 14 turns. And I think that this, considering it only costs 2 mana, is really quite the buff. And I understand that while Sernando's speed is not as high as some of the other attackers, especially, when you come up into fated attackers, he really falls behind. But he can still get this off at least once in a fight, and relatively early on because it's only 2 mana. And then once that happens, he just enables his team, and honestly, after he gets his A1 off, I think he could just die. Because he's done his job 14 turns when the rest of your DPS attacks. It should pretty much be over after that, right? So I just think that this is actually quite a significant buff for really low mana, and you can't sleep on this skill. His A2, Proctor of God, 4 mana, deals 204% damage to all enemies. This, I think, is fine. It's got the burst modifier, which, you could, unless you 6-star him, he can only reach up to 5 mana, so he'll only get at least the +1 mana burst. Really, I think this is fine. It's not amazing. Really, what you want Sernando for is the utility in his A1, like I said. And, since you disagree, why don't you sort of talk about some of the weaknesses he has and maybe why the A1 is not as good as I'm thinking?
Sure, but before I jump into that, where would you have ranked him out of the 11 heroes that we have?
Okay, sure. So for me, I think I'd honestly put him maybe around 8, so I'd bump him up 3 spots. Because, again, like I said, it's not about the damage he does, it's not about his A2 or mana utilization, it's just all he needs to do is get off that one buff. He just needs to get the crit, and then I think he's already useful.
Yeah, on the surface I agree with what you said. Definitely the A1 with the utility that he brings, and, the critical hit increase, that's pretty good. But here's the issue that I have. So Sernando has relatively low speed, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So he comes in at just attack speed of 50, which is pretty low. I think a lot of the attackers, especially if we think about the top tier fated attackers, that you want to amplify their damage, right? And for example, Jane, Baraka, all higher than that. I think even Bathory is 67.
Yeah, 70-ish.
Up there. So this is the issue because you want to be able to amplify their skill before they do the damage, right? And with lower speed, it means all the other attackers that you want to focus on will get their move before Sernando will be able to boost their critical hit. So there's a little bit of dis-synergy there. And also the fact that this skill costs 2 mana. So it's very unlikely that he will even be able to use it on the first round, right? His very first turn, given that he has mana utilization 2, it requires at least 10 mana across all of your allies in order to generate 1 mana. So, even if you pair him up with someone that has flow of mana that grants him 1 permanent mana, you still need your team to have 10 overall mana in order for him to get to 2 mana to use this skill. So I think there are a lot of situations where he might not even be able to use it. So what end up happening is all of your attackers would have moved twice before he can get the skill off. And I think by then, where the damage has already been done, and I think
how would the attackers have moved twice before we get the skill off?
Because the attackers, for example, if we use Jing as an example, right? Jing would be one of the first to move, and then Sernando would get his turn. But on that turn, he might not have enough mana to cast this skill, right? So you ended up maybe using the auto attack, and then Jin will obviously move again before Sernando gets his second turn and able to cast this. So I think if he is in the 110 speed range, I think that would actually be quite a big boost for him, because then he can really utilize this skill before some of your heavy damage dealer gets their moves. But the fact that he's slow just really kind of turns me off. So I'm putting him at the bottom. I think he's got potential, but he needs a speed buff.
You know, that's actually a great point. I mean, the speed thing is just so huge because, as you mentioned, he needs time to set up in order to get his A1 off, which is only 2 mana. But you know who doesn't need time to set up and can do damage immediately? The next person on our list, and that's Duncan. And so, Duncan, his A1 Iron Fist block, again, 2 mana, but it deals 300% damage to 1 enemy. And so this is actually pretty mana efficient, 150% damage per mana. And considering, again, he is an attacker, so the base attack is going to be quite high, and he'll be able to use that pretty regularly, so there's some good damage there. Rocket Puncher, 4 mana, deals 204% damage to all enemies, so this is exactly the same as Sernando's A2. I think that in that sense, the reason why we have decided to rank Duncan just one step above is that difference in the A1, and it is that speed lag that Sernando has that really makes it difficult for him to get out the utility that otherwise would put him higher up on the list. But because it requires that setup, then we have to put Duncan ahead because he's just able to provide that immediate value, which we think is more valuable in today's meta.
Right, I agree. Duncan with 92 speed, definitely will be able to kind of, do damage more consistently. But I still think one of the issue with Duncan is, and the fact that, why we capped him at number 10 is the fact that both of his skills are relatively high mana cost. A1 is 2, it's okay, not like super high, but I would like to see that being just like a 1 mana cost skill. And A2 costs 4. And on the surface, this doesn't seem too bad, but the issue is he has counter 2 passive. And in our opinion, counter 2 is really a suboptimal mana generation skill, because what it does is it grants you 1 mana if the target dies when you counter attack them. And man,
that's so unlikely.
Right, that's so unlikely, right? This is not like final hit 2 when they're already at low HP. This is just you countering attacking someone who just did damage to you. So the chance of that happening is pretty low. And also, if you combine that with the fact that Duncan is a machine type hero who, in our opinion, also isn't the best when it comes to generating mana, because machine grants you 1 mana on your turn if your HP is above 80%. And you probably get that off on the very first turn, but that's probably it, right? Like going forward, you might be at a much lower HP and you'll never be able to utilize that mana generation again. So overall, although his skills are okay, but the lack of mana generation really hinders his ability to use his skills consistently. But with that being said, let's look at our number 9 on the list, and that's Benton, the third of the 5 great generals of Sin West and the only attacker among the list.
So this actually, now that you mention it, it kind of bothers me, because I really don't think Benton deserves to stand with Garf and Valar, who are both just...
Or Tantalo.
I think Tantalo is better than Benton.
Oh, for sure.
So the fact that he's up there, I mean, come on, you have to make him a little bit better, right? Because right now, he's just sitting at number 9, and let me tell you why. Again, the counter passive is not great at generating mana, as Hal just mentioned. He is nature type, which is a little bit better. Now, his A1, White Wing Judgment, 1 mana, 240% damage to 1 enemy. So this is actually quite good, and I think this is why we put him above Duncan, because it's spammable, it's more mana efficient. I mean, basically, if you have no reason to use his A2, you're just doing 240% damage every turn. Now, I think his A2 is actually kind of where he's a little bit weak, in the sense that it's 5 mana, so that would be all of his mana, and it attacks all enemies for 285% damage. Now the damage is quite good, it's just the mana efficiency I'm not sure is quite there, and it comes with the burst modifier, which doesn't really make sense. For those of you that don't know, what burst does is if you have a skill that has that purple burst on it, what it means is for every 1 mana you are above the cost threshold, you will do 15% more damage. And so if you were to pick up Benton today and use him, he caps at 5 mana, and all heroes do unless you upgrade them to 6-star, where their cap increases to 10. Now, would this ever happen with Benton? Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely or a good use of your resources? No. It's much better to save that for faded heroes or heroes that could just provide a lot more utility. So even other attackers that are higher up on this tier list. So that's why we have Benton at number 9 here. And the next step up, we have David Johnson. David Johnson? Yeah. And then I'll let Hao take care of that one.
Yeah. So yeah, David Johnson, I think very similar to Benton in a way that, you know, we see a lot of these attackers with counter 2, and I think there are only 2 type of passives when it comes to attack heroes, and they are mana utilization 2 and counter 2, right? And among these 2, counter 2 definitely just feels a little bit underwhelming. Mana utilization, not only does it bring you a little bit more damage, and also it just generates mana a little bit more consistent, especially for late game players who has a lot of heroes that have been 6-starred, you know, with a larger mana pool. You can actually generate mana pretty consistently, where counter 2, the fact that you have to kill someone to get that additional mana, it's suboptimal to say the least. And David Johnson kind of suffers from the same issue that we've talked about when it comes to Duncan and Benton. It's that he doesn't really generate that much mana through his counter 2, but one thing that puts him slightly above the other 2 is the fact that his skills are also a little bit more mana efficient. So his A1 only costs 1 mana, that's 240% damage, very similar to how Benton has his A1, but his A2, instead of costing 5 mana, it only costs 3 mana in this case, and it does AoE damage similar to Benton, but only 142%, still has burst. So I think the fact that his A2 only costs 3 mana means that you can actually use this skill with a little bit more flexibility. If you do need to get some damage off right away, that you have that option to do it. Or if you don't, you can then save it up until 5 mana with a burst to do a little bit more damage. So you have that flexibility there, and I think that's what puts him ahead of Benton. But with that being said, let's take a look at our number 7 on the list. That's Astarte or Astarte.
Again, I'm not quite sure how to approach it. I'm just going to go with Astarte. I think that's just how we're going to say it for this video. So again, counter 2, not much to say about that. Right. That's the only passive she has. A1, spinning attack, which is just such a creative name. Requires 3 mana, which is quite high for really high. A single target ability, but it does 420% damage to one enemy. Then her A2, again, very high mana cost, 5 mana, but it deals 840% damage to one enemy. And as an attack hero, like, they have the highest base attack of all the other classes. So this is really quite a significant amount. Again, it comes with the burst modifier, which is a little bit weird, but even without it, it's a very chunky ability. And so I think that it goes without saying, Astarte is really, as far as attackers go, the premier sort of single target nuker, single target burst hero here. And her glaring weakness is, again, her high mana cost combined with the low mana generation that's inherent in her kit. Of course, if you paired her with somebody like the new FC Iris, if you paired her with somebody that has flow of mana to grant, 1 mana permanently to the backline, I think that would make things a lot easier for her. As it stands as a singular individual hero, I just think that those weaknesses really keep her from being higher up on the list. But, I mean, as far as straight damage goes, she's one of the best.
Yeah, I agree. I think the one thing that would help her a little bit is she is nature element. So that is one of the better ones when it comes to mana generation, because whenever someone on the battlefield is lower on HP, you're able to generate a little bit of mana. So,
and that's allies and opponents.
Exactly. So that's quite good. But yeah, like you said, otherwise, she doesn't really have that, and just a lot of high potential when it comes to damage, but consistency might be a little bit lower.
And so now why don't we take a look at our personal hero and the one that carried us several rounds through the gauntlet last week, and that will be Zeradin coming in at number 6.
Yeah. So with Zeradin, I think Zeradin is your poor man's Maggie. Both of his skills are AoE, so it's pretty good, and both of those skills are very low mana cost. A1 is only 1 mana cost, does 81% damage to all enemies, A2 costs 3, that's 142%. So he's really going to be there to do consistent AoE damage for your team and able to, proc those Guardian Stones whenever he can. And he also has Mana Utilization 2 passive. And as we mentioned, Mana Utilization 2 is a little bit better than Counter when it comes to generating mana. So whenever the mana count of all your allies is 10 or more, he gets 1 additional mana and able to use his skills a little bit more often. So overall, his kit is pretty good. I think when we compare Zeradin against the next one on our tier list, Scarlett, we really think his base kit actually offers a little bit more than what Scarlett can bring. And a lot of that is in his ability to use those low mana cost skills more frequently and be more of a consistent damage threat. But when we get to Scarlett, we'll see that Scarlett brings something that obviously Zeradin cannot bring, and that's her Fate Core. So Edward, why don't you talk a little bit more about Scarlett here?
Yeah, sure. So of course, Mana Utilization 2 here, we've already gone over it. When your allies have 10 mana, then she gets 1 when it's her turn. It makes sense. She's a mage, like a caster type, so I think that it's pretty clear she'd have that passive. Chain Fireball, her A1, requires 3 mana, deals 142% damage to all enemies. Now, as you mentioned, Scarlett is really like a copy of Zeradin, but with just higher damage, higher mana cost. Now, I do think that Zeradin, because he has the lower mana cost, it gives him more of that flexibility, as you mentioned, right? The burst on his A2, the total cost is 3 mana, so you could actually utilize that burst and get 30% more damage on that ability just by saving up to 5. Whereas Scarlett is just capped, she just does 285 and that's all she's going to be able to do unless you 6-star. So I don't think there's too much to say here, but we can go ahead and take a look at her Fate Core and see what's different here. So Scarlett comes in, and I believe she was the first of the Summer Festa Fate Core, the Son of the Southland Scarlett. And so we can see here, she still has Mana Utilization 2, but she comes with 2 extra passives, and I think this is really, like you said, what puts her above Zeradin, because there's just so much utility here. The first one being Flop Flop. If a caster has a removable buff, recovery, or positive effect applied, each valid attack imbues modification for 3 turns. And for those of you who haven't seen it, modification just turns the enemy into a rubber duck. So, I mean, what's not to like about that? Summer's Blessing has a special ability where when the battle starts, it grants frost damage immunity for 1 time to all allies. It can't be stacked, and it also grants a buff that increases the target's attack by 50% for 9 turns when the frost immunity effect is removed. And this is really one of the things that makes the whole line of Summer Festa heroes so good. And now, because Scarlett is AoE, the moment you give her any type of buff, like let's say you're running Scarlet Sernando, and Sernando actually manages to get his A1 off, she'll have the crit buff, and then when she uses any of her abilities, she's going to modify the entire enemy team. And I think that, considering you could just keep doing this as you get buffs throughout the fight, it's actually pretty annoying on AoE champions, which I think is one of the things that sets Scarlett apart here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think once you have FC Scarlett, how you want to use it is really not save the mana up for her A2, but rather just spend her A1 as often as you possibly can. Try to use that, consistent damage alongside of these AoE CC. So she essentially becomes kind of a CC bot for you. So I think that additional utility that she can bring puts her a little bit over Zeradin for us. But hey, you never know, maybe Zeradin will get a pretty unique Fate Core at some point.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, he already looks pretty cool, like with the 3-eyed mask thing. I like the aesthetic, so a Fate Core would be nice. Yeah. Unless it's what is the one where they all turn into little girls?
the reverse world.
Reverse world, yeah, reverse world Zeradin. Let's look forward to that. But something else we should look forward to is number 4 on our list here, which is Brook. And now Brook is actually somebody that I disagree with you on. You put him here as number 4, and I wasn't too sure about that. So I'm going to talk about like my doubts, and you could address them. So the A1 here is High Tackle. It's 1 mana, 240% damage to 1 enemy. It's solid. It's pretty basic, right? Just like an empowered auto attack, essentially. Then he has Furious Rush, 3 mana, which deals 420% damage to 1 enemy, and has Burst, which I think is nice. And then he's got the counter 2 with Dragon Hunter Blessing and then Dragon Scale of Chaos. And now, for me, I think that when you look at his kit, just at face value, it's solid. It's pretty good, right? Like, he does damage and single target, it's decently high, and he's got a nice dragon passive. My issue is, I don't really understand why he is number 4 on the list, where Astarte is number 7. When I think Astarte does a similar role, right? High, like, damage on a single target. The only thing she's missing is a dragon passive, which, I'll concede that point. That's really important. But without that, like, do you think that Brook without the dragon passive is still better than Astarte? And what's your reasoning there?
I think the biggest issue with me is, again, when it comes to damage, I like consistent damage, right? Because imagine the scenario. With Brook, you can use his A1 potentially on the very first turn, right? With 240% damage. And with Astarte, it's very unlikely that you will be able to use her A1 on the very first turn, which costs 3 mana. So imagine the scenario, the second turn rolls around, and Astarte able to use her A2, in this case, 420% damage. So overall, across the 2 turns, maybe she got 1 auto attack off and then 240% damage. Where if we look at Brook, if he can use his A1 again, which is very likely, so his overall damage is going to be 480 across 2 turns.
Okay, hold on. So you said across 2 turns, Brook gets 240% damage twice, so that's 480.
Sure.
Okay? Now, assuming a basic attack does 100% of your attack, then we go over to Astarte. So that would be 100% plus 420% in 2 turns. So that's 520, which is more than 480.
Right. But it's not dramatically different. And that's what I mean. It's when the damage overall is not too different across multiple turns, what I would like to see is able to be consistently doing damage. Right? If I want to finish someone off on the very first turn, would I trust Astarte's auto attack more, or would I trust Brook's A1 a little bit more? I think in that situation, I would like to use Brook's A1, which might guarantee the kill a little bit better. Imagine if later on during some part of the fight, you need to finish someone off, and Astarte doesn't have 3 mana to use her A1. I think that situation would never happen with Brook. So I think that's why I'm giving Brook a little bit of a higher score here. And obviously, I think Dragon's Hunter passive is also very underrated because there's only, I believe, 4 or 5 heroes that has Dragon Hunter passive. So you're able to use him during the weekend days, Dragon Hound. So I think that also provides quite a bit of value. And not to say that Brook also has a Fate Core as well, even though I don't think it's a great Fate Core.
He does have it.
But he does have it, and it adds a little bit of a survivability to him.
So I mean, I think that ultimately, as we talk about how these heroes look on paper and how these heroes would act in practice, ultimately, Astarte is somebody that requires a lot of mana setup, and it takes a couple turns to build up to be able to use that hefty 840% damage A2. And so I think that she would do better in certain situations where you have a priority target, just one guy you want to get rid of, and that person won't be able to kill your Astarte in time, and she has other heroes to support her. Whereas Brook would do better on a more well-balanced team,
right,
where you're just kind of expecting damage to come consistently.
Yeah.
So it's really more of a situational thing.
Yeah, and I would say if you do have a mana battery on your team, especially, now a lot of people might have FC Iris, I think in that case, Astarte definitely becomes a better choice. Because if mana is not an issue, then you go with whoever has the highest damage potential, right?
Yes, yeah.
So Astarte in that case would definitely outshine Brook and move into kind of the higher tier. But again, there's a level of dependencies on other heroes that's kind of hindering her overall ranking, at least in my opinion.
Sure. So let's move on now to our number 3 and number 2 pick, and we're going to talk about these kind of together, and it's Adams and Otard. So Adams starting off, counter 2 passive, again, pretty basic, we don't need to go into that. His A1, Crushing Shadows, 2 mana, deals 300% damage to one enemy. Pretty solid, we've seen this ability on other heroes as well. Reaper's Sickle requires 4 mana and deals 600% damage to one enemy with the burst modifier. So again, he's a single target damage dealer, just like Brook, just like Astarte, and he's number 3 on our list. Why is that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that really comes through his Fate Core, right? If we look at just the base Adams here, He's very similar to Brook, very similar to Astarte. He's kind of in between the two, right? Slightly higher mana cost than Brook, slightly lower mana cost than Astarte. Slightly higher damage on both of his skills than Brook, slightly lower damage on both of her skills than Astarte. So that kind of puts him just in between these two. I do think the slightly higher mana cost definitely kind of puts him slightly below Brook when it comes to mana efficiency, especially because he's a dark hero. And I don't think dark hero, when it comes to mana generation, is as good as fire elements. So I definitely give that to Brook. But what puts him above the other two is his Fate Core. I think his Fate Core, one of the Benga family Fate Core, definitely brings a lot of value in terms of its ability to lower opponent's speed, lower opponent's defense, and eventually do AoE damage when you level it up to, level 3 hard strike. So there's a lot of value in that and a lot of overall damage potential. The Fate Core does require a decent amount of setup, and which is one of the reasons I have him a little bit lower than Otard, because the Benga family, as good as the hard strike passive is, definitely takes time to set it up. And sometimes you really need to have maybe 2 or 3 Benga family together in order to maximize that potential. If you have just Adams by himself, I don't think he's as good as Otard, even with his Fate Core.
Sure, and not to mention, Otard also has a Fate Core, but first let's just talk about her base kit. Again, counter 2 passive, Dragon Knight's Blessing, everyone knows what those are by now. A1, Brutal Axe, deals 420% damage to one enemy for 3 mana, and Destruction Blow, her A2, is 5 mana and deals 285% damage to all enemies. So again, she reminds me of Astarte, but with an AoE A2, essentially, right? High mana cost, high damage, and that's really all she provides. So why is she number 2? One, I think that having the split between single target and AoE, having the choice between the two, is so valuable, especially in PvP situations where you could run into champions with counter passives, where you could run into champions where, like, if you hit them, like a thrust, maybe if you hit them, they'll stun you. And so it's really important to be able to have the choice to be able to say, I only want to hit one guy, or I want to hit everybody, depending on the situation. So that's one thing that puts her above. And as Hal mentioned, it's the same thing with Adams. She has a Fate Core. And now her Fate Core is much simpler than Adams in that she doesn't have anything fancy like a Heart Strike or anything like that, but instead what she has is her passive gets upgraded to counter 3, which makes it so much more efficient at generating mana, because now there's 2 instances where you can get mana, one if the target dies, and the other if the target you hit is 70% or more, which is basically both ends of the spectrum here. She also gets an Awakening passive, Dominator of Battle, which increases her crit by 360 and decreases block by 180, gives her damage immunity for 4 turns when her health drops below 30%, and increases speed by 25. These are all things that a damage dealer wants, right? Increased speed, increased crit. Lower defense doesn't really matter, because honestly, if FC Otard hits you once or twice, the fight's pretty much over. So I think that the FC is really what puts her above. Adams, again, Hard Strike is obviously much stronger, but does require the setup where Otard is consistent. Right when you get her, you know she's going to do this amount of damage, and she'll do it every time. And we put a lot of value on that.
Yeah.
So coming in at number 1, we have Annie, and I will let Hal tell you all about that.
And I think Annie is no surprise at number 1, right? I think her base kit is relatively simple. I think her base kit doesn't really bring too much of a surprise. Single target damage on her A1 and then AoE damage on her A2. And obviously, I think she has the mana utilization passive as well. So it's a good mix of single target and AoE damage. Nothing really separates her from, let's say, Scarlett or Zeradin when we look at these heroes. What really brings her tier above everyone else and puts her pretty much on the same level with the likes of FC Rira, likes of FC Battery, is that it's her Fate Core passive, Burning Soul. And what it does is it grants the ally with the highest attack speed, damage immunity, and 300% increase in critical hit for 2 turns, as well as 3 additional mana at the beginning of every round. And that is huge because what she essentially does is she sets up your best damage dealer. Whoever your primary damage dealer is, whether it's Battery, which probably unlikely because she's relatively slow, But imagine if you're building a team around FC Rira, or FC Rutley, or FC Jin. What she does is not only will she be able to keep them alive and give them much needed survivability through her damage immunity, she will also allow them to do a lot more damage by increasing their critical hit by 300%. And more importantly, the fact that she grants 3 mana to them means her target will always be able to use their high impact skills whenever they want to. In our lineup, we have FC Rira, and whenever you have FC Annie with FC Rira, she will essentially be able to use her A2 at the beginning of every single turn. And that is just massive. Be able to do that sort of damage is critical, especially in PvP situations. So when we're thinking about FC Annie, it's really not about how much damage she can do, right? Very different from how we think about Otard or Adams. But it's more about how much damage she can allow your best damage dealer do, right? So she essentially makes FC Rira better, makes FC Jim better, makes FC Rutley better. So the question we really have to ask is, do you want FC Otard or do you want a better FC Rira? And I think in most situations, like, we're always gonna go with a much improved FC Rira. So that's what Annie can bring with her Fate Core, and that's why we have her at the top of her list.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's actually kind of funny because I mentioned very early on at the beginning of the video with Sernando how all he needs to do is get his crit buff off and he could die, and then he's done his job. But Fate Core Annie does that with damage immunity, with mana generation every turn. I mean, she's essentially just a infinitely better Sernando, which is ironic because they're on opposite ends of the list here. But that wraps it up for us today. Please do let us know if you have any of these heroes, what your thoughts are with them. If you disagree with any of our points, please leave us a message in the comments and we can discuss. Of course, we love getting some discussion and interaction on the channel, so that would be great. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. We will be following up with the rest of the legendary tier list, so please keep an eye out for that. And we will see you guys in the next video.